Zara's claws scraped against the cold metal floor as she dragged herself across her cell. The chains around her wrists and ankles clinked with every movement, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 3 years. Her once beautiful silver fur was now matted and dirty, showing patches where it had been torn out during the worst beatings. The Korthak had taken her from her home planet when she was barely 17. They said her species, the Villani, made excellent slaves because they were intelligent enough to follow complex orders, but too peaceful to fight back effectively. Zara had learned the hard way that this was mostly true. Every time she had tried to resist, the punishment had been swift and brutal. "Slave 4779, get up." The harsh voice of Overseer Grex echoed through the holding area. Zara's muscles tensed automatically at the sound. Grex was the worst of her captors, a massive Korthak with scarred purple skin and eyes that seemed to enjoy causing pain. Zara struggled to her feet, her legs shaking from exhaustion. She had been working in the mines for 18 hours straight, hauling heavy containers of precious metals that the Korthak sold to wealthy worlds across the galaxy. Her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, and her hands were raw from gripping the rough handles. "You're moving too slow," Grex snarled, stepping closer. The shock prod in his hand crackled with electricity. "Maybe you need a reminder of what happens to lazy slaves." Zara closed her eyes and braced herself for the pain. She had learned not to beg or cry out, as it only made things worse. But instead of the expected shock, she heard another voice from across the holding area. "Sir, we have incoming ships on the long-range scanners," another guard called out. "3 vessels, unknown configuration." Grex paused, his attention diverted. "What? How did they get past our perimeter defenses?" "We don't know, sir. They're moving fast and not responding to our warnings." Zara dared to open her eyes and saw Grex's expression change from cruel satisfaction to worry. In all her time here, she had never seen the Korthak look afraid of anything. The mining station was heavily defended, with dozens of fighter ships and powerful energy shields. What kind of force could make them nervous? "Lock down all slave quarters," Grex ordered. "Double the guards and prepare for possible boarding action." As the guards hurried to carry out their orders, Zara found herself being herded back into her cell, along with dozens of other slaves. The Villani weren't the only species trapped here. She could see tall, thin Arxians with their distinctive blue skin, small furry Mekons who reminded her of Earth's raccoons, and even a few others she didn't recognize. The cell door slammed shut with a metallic clang, and Zara pressed herself against the back wall. Through the small window, she could see emergency lights beginning to flash red throughout the station. Alarms blared in the distance, and she could hear the heavy footsteps of Korthak soldiers running through the corridors. "What do you think is happening?" whispered Kef, an elderly Arxian who had been captured years before Zara. His once bright blue skin had faded to a dull gray, and his movements were slow and painful. "I don't know," Zara replied, but something inside her dared to hope. Maybe someone finally came to help us. Kef shook his head sadly. "No one knows we're here, child. The Korthak are too careful for that. This is probably just a territorial dispute or pirates looking for easy treasure." But Zara wasn't so sure. She had seen something in Grex's eyes that she had never witnessed before. Genuine fear. The Korthak were bullies who picked on the weak and defenseless. They wouldn't be afraid of pirates or rival gangs. This had to be something bigger. The sound of explosions suddenly echoed through the station, making the walls shake. Dust fell from the ceiling, and several slaves cried out in alarm. The lights flickered, and for a moment everything went dark before the emergency power kicked in. "They're inside the station," Zara breathed, her heart racing. She pressed her face against the window, trying to see what was happening in the corridor outside. More explosions followed, closer this time. She could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons being fired and the shouts of Korthak soldiers. But there were other sounds too. Voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize, calm and controlled even in the middle of battle. A Korthak guard ran past her cell, his armor smoking and his weapon nowhere to be seen. He looked over his shoulder as if something terrible was chasing him. Zara had never seen one of their captors look so terrified. "Whatever's out there," she whispered to herself, "it's winning." The thought filled her with a mixture of hope and terror. Hope because anything had to be better than the life she was living now. Terror because she had no idea what these new arrivals might want with the slaves. Maybe they were even worse than the Korthak. But as the sounds of battle grew closer and the emergency lights continued to flash, Zara found herself praying to the ancient gods of her people. She prayed for freedom, for a chance to see her home world again, for an end to the pain and suffering that had become her entire existence. The explosions were getting louder now, and she could smell smoke drifting through the air vents. Whatever was happening, it was moving through the station like an unstoppable force. The Korthak's confident shouts had turned to panicked screams, and more guards were running past her cell in full retreat. Zara closed her eyes and made herself a promise. If by some miracle she survived whatever was coming, she would never again let herself be helpless. She would learn to fight, to be strong, to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. The scared, broken girl who had been captured 3 years ago was gone. What remained was someone harder, someone who had learned that the universe was full of monsters, but maybe, just maybe, it had heroes too. The sound of footsteps approached her cell, different from the heavy boots of the Korthak. These were lighter, more measured, and they stopped right outside her door. Zara's claws scraped against the cold metal floor as she dragged herself across her cell. The chains around her wrists and ankles clinked with every movement, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 3 years. Her once beautiful silver fur was now matted and dirty, showing patches where it had been torn out during the worst beatings. The Korthak had taken her from her home planet when she was barely 17. They said her species, the Villani, made excellent slaves because they were intelligent enough to follow complex orders but too peaceful to fight back effectively. Zara had learned the hard way that this was mostly true. Every time she had tried to resist, the punishment had been swift and brutal. "Slave 4779, get up!" The harsh voice of Overseer Grex echoed through the holding area. Zara's muscles tensed automatically at the sound. Grex was the worst of her captors, a massive Korthak with scarred purple skin and eyes that seemed to enjoy causing pain. Zara struggled to her feet, her legs shaking from exhaustion. She had been working in the mines for 18 hours straight, hauling heavy containers of precious metals that the Korthak sold to wealthy worlds across the galaxy. Her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, and her hands were raw from gripping the rough handles. "You're moving too slow," Grex snarled, stepping closer. The shock prod in his hand crackled with electricity. "Maybe you need a reminder of what happens to lazy slaves." Zara closed her eyes and braced herself for the pain. She had learned not to beg or cry out, as it only made things worse, but instead of the expected shock, she heard another voice from across the holding area. "Sir, we have incoming ships on the long-range scanners," another guard called out. "3 vessels, unknown configuration." Grex paused, his attention diverted. "What? How did they get past our perimeter defenses?" "We don't know, sir. They're moving fast and not responding to our warnings." Zara dared to open her eyes and saw Grex's expression change from cruel satisfaction to worry. In all her time here, she had never seen the Korthak look afraid of anything. The mining station was heavily defended, with dozens of fighter ships and powerful energy shields. What kind of force could make them nervous? "Lock down all slave quarters," Grex ordered. "Double the guards and prepare for possible boarding action." As the guards hurried to carry out their orders, Zara found herself being herded back into her cell, along with dozens of other slaves. The Villani weren't the only species trapped here. She could see tall, thin Arxians with their distinctive blue skin, small, furry Meekans who reminded her of Earth's raccoons, and even a few others she didn't recognize. The cell door slammed shut with a metallic clang, and Zara pressed herself against the back wall. Through the small window, she could see emergency lights beginning to flash red throughout the station. Alarms blared in the distance, and she could hear the heavy footsteps of Korthak soldiers running through the corridors. "What do you think is happening?" whispered Kef, an elderly Arxian who had been captured years before Zara. His once bright blue skin had faded to a dull gray, and his movements were slow and painful. "I don't know," Zara replied, but something inside her dared to hope. "Maybe someone finally came to help us." Kef shook his head sadly. "No one knows we're here, child. The Korthak are too careful for that. This is probably just a territorial dispute or pirates looking for easy treasure." But Zara wasn't so sure. She had seen something in Grex's eyes that she had never witnessed before. Genuine fear. The Korthak were bullies who picked on the weak and defenseless. They wouldn't be afraid of pirates or rival gangs. This had to be something bigger. The sound of explosions suddenly echoed through the station, making the walls shake. Dust fell from the ceiling, and several slaves cried out in alarm. The lights flickered, and for a moment everything went dark before the emergency power kicked in. "They're inside the station," Zara breathed, her heart racing. She pressed her face against the window, trying to see what was happening in the corridor outside. More explosions followed, closer this time. She could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons being fired and the shouts of Korthak soldiers. But there were other sounds, too. Voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Calm and controlled even in the middle of battle. A Korthak guard ran past her cell, his armor smoking and his weapon nowhere to be seen. He looked over his shoulder as if something terrible was chasing him. Zara had never seen one of their captors look so terrified. "Whatever's out there," she whispered to herself, "it's winning." The thought filled her with a mixture of hope and terror. Hope because anything had to be better than the life she was living now. Terror because she had no idea what these new arrivals might want with the slaves. Maybe they were even worse than the Korthak. But as the sounds of battle grew closer and the emergency lights continued to flash, Zara found herself praying to the ancient gods of her people. She prayed for freedom, for a chance to see her home world again, for an end to the pain and suffering that had become her entire existence. The explosions were getting louder now, and she could smell smoke drifting through the air vents. Whatever was happening, it was moving through the station like an unstoppable force. The Korthak's confident shouts had turned to panicked screams, and more guards were running past her cell in full retreat. Zara closed her eyes and made herself a promise. If by some miracle she survived whatever was coming, she would never again let herself be helpless. She would learn to fight, to be strong, to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. The scared, broken girl who had been captured 3 years ago was gone. What remained was someone harder, someone who had learned that the universe was full of monsters, but maybe, just maybe, it had heroes too. The sound of footsteps approached her cell, different from the heavy boots of the Korthak. These were lighter, more measured, and they stopped right outside her door. The medical bay of the human ship was unlike anything Zara had ever experienced. Soft lights that somehow adjusted themselves to be comfortable for her sensitive eyes, beds that seemed to mold themselves to support her injured body, and machines that hummed quietly while they worked to heal years of damage and neglect. Dr. Sarah Chen, the human physician assigned to Zara's case, had gentle hands and an even gentler manner. She explained every procedure before performing it, asked permission before touching her patient, and never showed any disgust or pity at the extent of Zara's injuries. "Your bone density is about 60% of what it should be," Dr. Chen explained as she reviewed the scanner results. "That's from poor nutrition and lack of proper exercise. The good news is that Villani physiology responds well to our bone regeneration treatments. You should see significant improvement within a few weeks." Zara nodded, still overwhelmed by the concept of voluntary medical care. Among the Korthak, injured slaves were either left to heal on their own or simply replaced if their injuries were too severe. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "The psychological trauma you've endured is going to take longer to heal than your physical injuries. We have counselors available who specialize in helping survivors of slavery and abuse." "I don't need counseling," Zara said quickly. "I'm fine," Dr. Chen gave her a knowing look. "Zara, it's completely normal to feel like you need to be strong and independent after what you've been through. But healing isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of courage." Before Zara could respond, the medical bay doors opened and Marcus walked in. He had cleaned up since the rescue operation, trading his combat armor for simple civilian clothes, but his presence still commanded attention. Zara noticed how the other humans in the medical bay straightened slightly when they saw him, a sign of respect rather than fear. "How's our patient doing?" he asked Dr. Chen. "Physically, she's responding well to treatment. The broken ribs have been mended, and we've started her on a nutrition program to address the deficiencies. Psychologically," Dr. Chen glanced meaningfully at Zara, "that's going to take more time." Marcus nodded and approached Zara's bed. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to a nearby chair. Zara shook her head, curious about why he was here. Surely someone as important as Marcus had better things to do than visit one freed slave among the hundreds they had rescued. "I wanted to talk to you about what happens next," Marcus said, settling into the chair. "Dr. Chen tells me you haven't expressed any preference about where you'd like to go." "I don't know," Zara admitted. "My home world. I don't even know if my family is still alive." And I'm not the same person who was taken from there 3 years ago. I don't know if I could fit in anymore. Marcus leaned forward slightly. You know, we've been doing these rescue operations for about 2 years now. I've met hundreds of people in your situation, and they all say something similar. They feel like they don't belong anywhere anymore, and don't they? Zara asked. Some of them, yes, but many others find that they belong exactly where they are, helping us stop this from happening to anyone else. Zara stared at him. You mean join your military? Not necessarily the military, though that's one option. We need translators, cultural advisors, intelligence analysts, diplomatic liaisons, people who understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of galactic oppression. Your perspective is valuable, Zara. More valuable than you might realize. The idea was overwhelming, after years of being told she was worthless, that her only value was the labor she could provide. Marcus was suggesting she could actually make a difference in the galaxy. I wouldn't know how to fight, she said. Fighting is just one skill among many, Marcus replied. And if you decide you want to learn, we're very good teachers. But there are plenty of ways to fight back against evil that don't involve weapons. Dr. Chen had been listening to their conversation with obvious approval. You don't have to decide anything right now, she interjected. The healing process takes time, and so does figuring out what you want to do with your freedom. Over the following days, as Zara's strength gradually returned, she found herself spending more time talking with Marcus. He visited the medical bay regularly, not just to check on her, but to listen to her stories about life under Korthak rule. She told him about the different species held as slaves, their various skills and abilities, and the brutal hierarchy the Korthak had established among their prisoners. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, she found herself saying one afternoon. It was the way they made us complicit in our own oppression. If you followed orders perfectly, you might get slightly better food. If you reported another slave for some minor infraction, you might avoid punishment yourself. They turned survival into a betrayal of everyone around you. Marcus listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed he truly understood the implications of what she was telling him. That's called manufactured complicity, he said. It's a deliberate tactic used by oppressive regimes to make their victims feel guilty for their own survival. Understanding how it works is the first step in overcoming it. How do you know so much about this? Zara asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Zara saw something painful flicker across his features. Because humans have done it to each other throughout our history. We've been slaves and we've been slavers. We've been victims of genocide and we've committed it ourselves. When we finally made it to the stars, we promised ourselves we would never again stand by and watch such things happen to anyone. The honesty of his answer surprised Zara. The Korthak had always portrayed themselves as naturally superior, destined to rule over lesser species. But Marcus was admitting that his own people had been capable of great evil as well as great good. What changed? She asked. We learned that our strength comes not from dominating others, but from protecting them. Not from taking what we want, but from giving what we can. It's not always easy. We still have people among us who think the old ways were better. But we've decided as a species that we'd rather be known for our compassion than our conquest. That evening, as Zara lay in her comfortable bed looking out at the stars through the medical bay's viewport, she made a decision. She didn't know exactly what form it would take, but she knew she wanted to be part of what the humans were building. She wanted to help ensure that no other child would experience what she had experienced. When Dr. Chen made her morning rounds, Zara was ready with her answer. I want to learn, she said simply. Whatever it takes, I want to learn how to fight back against the people who do these things. Dr. Chen smiled. I'll let Marcus know. But first we need to finish healing your body. The mind follows where the body leads, and you're going to need all your strength for what comes next. For the first time since her rescue, Zara found herself genuinely excited about the future. She was no longer just a victim hoping for survival. She was becoming something new, something powerful. She was becoming someone who could make a difference. 3 weeks later, Zara stood in the observation deck of the human ship Liberator, watching as they approached what Marcus called a freedom station. The massive structure looked like a small city floating in space, with docking bays, residential areas, training facilities, and what appeared to be an enormous garden section that rotated slowly to generate gravity. It's beautiful, Zara breathed. pressing her face against the transparent aluminum window. She had never seen anything quite like it. The design seemed to prioritize function and beauty equally, unlike the purely utilitarian Korthak structures she was used to. "Wait until you see the inside," Marcus said, joining her at the window. "This station houses about 50,000 people, all of them former slaves or refugees from various conflicts. It's become a symbol of what's possible when different species work together." Dr. Chen had finally cleared Zara for light duty, which meant she could begin what the humans called integration training. The program was designed to help rescued individuals adjust to freedom while learning skills that would help them contribute to the growing liberation movement. As their shuttle docked with the station, Zara marveled at the diversity she saw. Humans worked alongside Volani, Arxians, Mekons, and dozens of species she had never encountered before. What struck her most was how natural their interactions seemed. There was no obvious hierarchy based on species, no signs of the fear and submission she had grown accustomed to. "This is Commander Lisa Park," Marcus said, introducing Zara to a human woman with short gray hair and kind but watchful eyes. "She runs the integration program here." Commander Park shook Zara's hand with a firm grip. "Welcome to Freedom Station, Zara. Marcus has told me a lot about you." "I understand you're interested in joining our intelligence analysis division?" Zara nodded nervously. "I want to help stop what happened to me from happening to others. Marcus said my experience might be valuable for understanding how slave operations work." "It absolutely is," Commander Park confirmed. "But before we put you to work, we need to make sure you understand what you're getting into. Fighting the slave trade isn't just about military operations. It's about understanding economic systems, political networks, and psychological manipulation on a galactic scale." Over the following days, Zara was introduced to aspects of the liberation movement that she had never imagined. She met former slaves who had become brilliant strategists, refugees who had developed new technologies to help with rescue operations, and humans who had dedicated their entire lives to the cause of freedom. Her instructor was a Volani named Korin, who had been rescued 5 years earlier from a different Korthak facility. Unlike Zara, he had been trained as an engineer before his capture, and he had used his skills to help develop some of the movement's most advanced equipment. "The humans are remarkable," Korin told her during one of their sessions. "But what makes them truly special isn't their technology or their fighting ability. It's their absolute refusal to accept that suffering is inevitable." "What do you mean?" Zara asked. "Most species, when they achieve a certain level of comfort and security, become satisfied with maintaining the status quo. They don't want to risk what they have to help others. But humans seem incapable of that kind of complacency. They see injustice and they have to act, even when it would be easier to look the other way." Zara was beginning to understand what Korin meant. In her classes on galactic politics, she learned that humans were still relatively new to interstellar civilization. They had only developed faster than light travel about 30 years ago, making them one of the youngest spacefaring species. Most older civilizations had dismissed them as irrelevant. That had been a serious mistake. "The thing about humans," explained Dr. James Morrison, her instructor in xenopsychology, "is that they have an unusual relationship with authority. Most species develop rigid hierarchical structures as they evolve toward intelligence. It's efficient for survival. But humans retained a strong individual streak that makes them question authority, even their own." "Is that why they're so good at fighting?" Zara asked. "Partly yes, but it's also why they're so good at adapting. When humans encounter a problem, they don't just accept that it's always been that way. They ask, why can't we change this? And then they figure out how to do it." Zara experienced this firsthand when she mentioned to Marcus that she was having trouble with one of her technical training modules. The interface had been designed for human hands and didn't work well with Volani claws. "That's a problem we can solve," Marcus said immediately. Rather than telling her to adapt or find a workaround, he took her complaint to the engineering department. Within 2 days, they had developed a new interface system that worked perfectly for Volani physiology. "But I'm just one person," Zara protested when she saw the amount of effort that had gone into the solution. Surely this wasn't worth the time and resources. Marcus looked at her with genuine surprise. "Zara, if something doesn't work for you, it probably doesn't work for other Volani either. We want everyone to be able to contribute their best. which means making sure everyone has the tools they need to succeed. It was a completely alien concept to Zara. Among the Korthak, individuals were expected to adapt to existing systems, no matter how poorly those systems served them. The idea that systems should be adapted to serve individuals was revolutionary. As her training progressed, Zara began to see patterns in how humans approached problems. When faced with a seemingly impossible challenge, they didn't give up or accept defeat. They broke the problem down into smaller pieces and tackled each one systematically. When one approach didn't work, they tried another. And another. And another. Humans are persistent to the point of stubbornness, Corin observed one day as they watched a group of human engineers working on a new type of stealth drive. They've been at that design for 6 months and they still haven't gotten it to work properly. Any other species would have given up by now. Why don't they? Zara asked. Because they know that if they can make it work, it will save lives. And to humans, that's worth any amount of effort. This was demonstrated dramatically when an emergency rescue call came in during Zara's 4th week at the station. A slave transport had been intercepted by human forces, but the ship was booby-trapped and would explode if the rescue teams tried to force their way in. The Korthak had done this before. They would rather kill their slaves than lose them to rescue operations. Zara watched from the command center as human teams worked frantically to find a solution. They tried hacking the ship's systems, sending in micro-drones, even attempting to communicate with the slaves inside to guide them through disabling the trap themselves. "We're running out of time," Commander Park said, her voice tight with stress. "The bomb will detonate in 20 minutes whether we board the ship or not." That's when Marcus stepped forward with what seemed like an insane plan. "What if we don't board the ship at all?" he said. "What if we use the emergency transport system to beam the slaves directly off the ship? The energy requirements would be enormous," one of the engineers objected. "We'd have to drain power from half the fleet to make it work." "Then we drain power from half the fleet," Marcus replied without hesitation. It worked. All 300 slaves aboard the transport ship were successfully beamed to safety just minutes before the bomb exploded. The rescue ships barely had enough power left to limp back to the station, but everyone had survived. Later, as Zara helped process the rescued slaves, she realized something important. She wasn't just learning human tactics and technology, she was learning to think like a human, to see problems as challenges to be overcome rather than limitations to be accepted, to value every individual life as worth saving no matter the cost. She was becoming more than she had ever imagined possible. 6 months after her rescue, Zara stood in the strategy room of Freedom Station, studying a 3-dimensional hologram of a massive space facility. But this wasn't just any facility. It was the primary Korthak slave processing center for this entire sector of the galaxy. The place where captured individuals were broken down psychologically before being shipped out to various buyers. "We've been trying to find a way to hit this place for over a year," Commander Park explained to the assembled team. "But their security is too tight, and they have enough firepower to hold off our entire fleet." Zara stared at the hologram, her enhanced knowledge allowing her to read the tactical display with ease. The station was indeed formidable. Multiple shield generators, hundreds of defensive turrets, and a garrison of over 10,000 Korthak soldiers. It was designed to be impregnable, but Zara had an advantage that no one else in the room possessed. She had been inside a similar facility. "What if we're thinking about this wrong?" she said quietly, then louder when she realized the room had gone silent. "What if we don't try to fight our way in?" Marcus, who had been studying the display with a frown, turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Zara approached the hologram, her claws extending slightly as she pointed to specific sections. "Look at the design. It's built like all Korthak facilities, to keep people in, not to keep specific people out. They're not expecting someone who understands their systems to voluntarily enter the station." "You're talking about going undercover," Dr. Morrison said, his face creased with concern. "Zara, that's incredibly dangerous. If they recognize you..." "They won't," Zara interrupted, surprised by her own confidence. "I look completely different now. Proper nutrition, medical treatment, physical training. I'm not the broken slave they would remember. And I know how their systems work, how they think, how they categorize and process prisoners." Commander Park leaned forward, her tactical mind clearly engaged. "What exactly are you proposing?" A three-stage operation, Zara said, her training kicking in as she began to outline her plan. First, we let them capture me. I go in posing as a newly captured slave from a species they're not familiar with. While I'm being processed, I gather intelligence on their security protocols and identify weaknesses in their internal systems. Absolutely not, Marcus said firmly. We're not sending you back into slavery, even temporarily. Listen to her, Commander Park said, holding up a hand. What's stage 2? While I'm inside, I make contact with the existing slave population and begin organizing them. The Korthak never expect coordinated resistance from their prisoners because they've broken down communication between different groups. But if someone who understands their methods can get inside... Zara manipulated the hologram, highlighting the station's internal structure. Stage 3 is the real attack. While your forces engage their external defenses and draw their attention, the slaves inside simultaneously disable their internal security, their shield generators, and their communications array. The station tears itself apart from within. The room was quiet for a long moment as everyone processed the audacity of the plan. It was complex, dangerous, and relied on perfect timing and execution. It was also brilliant. It could work, Commander Park said slowly. But Zara, you understand that if anything goes wrong, we might not be able to get you out. You could end up back in permanent slavery. Then I'll have to make sure nothing goes wrong, Zara replied. Commander, I've spent 6 months learning from the best strategic minds in the galaxy. I speak 17 languages now. I understand 12 different cultural systems, and I know more about Korthak psychology than anyone else in this room. This is what you trained me for. Marcus was shaking his head. There has to be another way. We don't sacrifice our own people, Zara. That's not who we are. You're not sacrificing me, Zara said, meeting his eyes steadily. I'm choosing this. For the first time in my life, I'm making a choice about my own fate based on what I believe is right. Isn't that what freedom means? The debate continued for hours, with various team members raising objections and suggesting modifications. But gradually, the plan began to take shape. Zara would undergo additional training to pose as a member of a recently contacted species, complete with falsified biological markers and cultural knowledge. A small team of specialists would be inserted into the station's maintenance systems ahead of time to provide technical support. The main assault fleet would be positioned to strike at precisely the right moment. 3 weeks later, Zara found herself aboard a disguised transport ship, approaching the very type of facility she had sworn never to enter again. But this time was different. This time she was going in as a warrior, not a victim. The capture was deliberately sloppy, designed to look like the transport had been overwhelmed by a Korthak patrol. Zara allowed herself to be stunned and restrained, fighting just enough to maintain her cover, but not enough to cause serious injury to the human crew members playing their roles as slavers. When she woke up in a holding cell, the familiar sounds and smells of a Korthak slave facility washed over her. For a moment, she felt a surge of the old terror, the learned helplessness that had kept her compliant for so long. But then she remembered her training, her purpose, and the friends who were counting on her. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been dragged from her home world. She was Zara, intelligence operative of the Human Liberation Fleet, and she had work to do. The first phase of her mission was reconnaissance. As she was processed through the facility's intake system, she carefully observed their procedures, noting security checkpoints, guard rotations, and communication protocols. The Korthak had become complacent in their dominance, and their systems showed it. There were gaps everywhere for someone who knew what to look for. During her second week inside, she made contact with a group of Arxian prisoners who had maintained a hidden communication network throughout the facility. Using her knowledge of their language and culture, she was able to convince them that help was coming, and that they needed to be ready to act when the signal came. You really think your human friends can break through their defenses? Asked Vec, an elderly Arxian who had become the informal leader of the prisoner network. I know they can, Zara replied, but we need to do our part from inside. Are your people ready? Vec's expression was grim but determined. We've been ready for years. We just needed someone to show us how to fight back effectively. As the date for the operation approached, Zara felt a mixture of anticipation and terror. Everything depended on perfect timing and the courage of people who had been beaten down for years. But as she looked around at the faces of her fellow prisoners, faces that now showed hope instead of despair, she knew they were ready. The revolution was about to begin from within. The attack began at exactly 0300 station time, when most of the guards would be at their least alert. Zara felt the subtle vibration through the station's hull that meant the human fleet had begun their assault on the external defenses. It was time for her part of the plan to begin. Moving silently through the darkened corridors, she made her way to the first checkpoint where Vec and his team were waiting. The elderly Arxian had proven to be an excellent organizer, and the prisoner network had grown far beyond what anyone had expected. Nearly 3,000 slaves throughout the facility were ready to act on her signal. The external battle has started, she whispered to Vec as they crouched in an access tunnel beneath the main security hub. Are your teams in position? All positions confirmed, Vec replied. The Mekon technical specialists have already begun disabling the communication arrays on levels 7 through 12. Your human friends trained us well through those coded messages. Zara smiled grimly. One of the most ingenious aspects of the plan had been using the station's own prisoner transport system to spread instructions. By encoding tactical information in seemingly innocent conversations and having it pass through the informal networks that existed in every slave facility, they had been able to coordinate a facility-wide operation without the guards ever realizing what was happening. Remember, Zara said, we disable, we don't destroy. These systems will be valuable evidence for the war crimes tribunals later. Understood, Vec nodded. Though I admit after years of abuse, it's tempting to blow everything to pieces. The first phase went flawlessly. Working in carefully coordinated teams, the prisoners systematically took control of critical systems throughout the station. The Korthak had never imagined that their slaves could organize such a sophisticated operation, and their security protocols simply hadn't accounted for coordinated resistance from within. Zara's role was to take control of the main security center, which would allow her to coordinate with the human fleet and disable the station's primary defenses. But as she approached the heavily guarded facility, she came face to face with someone from her nightmares. Overseer Grek stood in the corridor ahead of her, still massive and intimidating, but now armed with military-grade weapons and a squad of elite guards. His yellow eyes widened with recognition as he saw her. Well, well, he snarled, his voice carrying the same cruel satisfaction she remembered from her time as his prisoner. If it isn't Little Slave 4779, did you really think we wouldn't recognize you eventually? Zara felt the familiar fear clawing at her mind, the conditioning that had kept her submissive for so long. But then she remembered Marcus's words about courage, Commander Park's lessons about tactical thinking, and Dr. Chen's teachings about healing from trauma. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. My name is Zara, she said clearly, standing straighter, and I'm here to shut down your operation. Grex laughed, the sound echoing through the corridor. You? A broken slave is going to shut down the most secure facility in Korthak space? I think those humans filled your head with fantasies, little one. The only fantasy here is your belief that you're still in control, Zara replied, activating the communication device hidden in her sleeve. All teams, this is Zara. Execute Phase 2 now. Throughout the station, the lights suddenly went out as the prisoners simultaneously took control of the power grid. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in a red glow that made the already tense situation feel even more dramatic. Grex's confidence wavered as alarms began blaring throughout the facility. What did you do? He demanded. I learned, Zara said simply. I learned that strength doesn't come from hurting others. It comes from protecting them. I learned that real power isn't about making people afraid of you. It's about giving them hope. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Grex and his guards had superior weapons and armor, but Zara had something they didn't: the support of every prisoner in the facility. As they tried to pin her down, former slaves emerged from maintenance tunnels and service corridors, creating a crossfire that the guards couldn't handle. When the shooting stopped, Grex lay wounded but alive on the floor. Zara stood over him, holding one of his own weapons, but she didn't fire. Instead, she activated her communication device again. Marcus, this is Zara. Main security is secured. You can begin your final approach. Copy that, Zara. Marcus's voice crackled through the static. Outstanding work. Medical teams are standing by for prisoner evacuation. Grex glared up at her with undimmed hatred. You think this changes anything? There are dozens of facilities like this one. Hundreds. You've saved a few thousand slaves, but there are millions more out there. You're right, Zara acknowledged. This is just the beginning. What Grex didn't understand was that the operation was about more than just freeing the prisoners in this facility. For months, human intelligence teams had been preparing for this moment, gathering evidence of Korthak slave operations throughout the galaxy. The data from this facility would be the final piece they needed to build an airtight case for the Galactic Council. As human ships docked with the station and medical teams began evacuating the prisoners, Zara made her way to the facility's main computer core. Here she would download terabytes of information about Korthak slave operations, shipping routes, buyer networks, financial records, and most importantly, the locations of other facilities. The data transfer took nearly an hour, during which time she watched through the station's viewports as more human ships arrived. Not just military vessels, but hospital ships, supply transports, and even civilian vessels that had volunteered to help with the rescue operation. The sight filled her with an emotion she was still learning to recognize: pride. When the transfer was complete, Zara finally allowed herself to feel the full impact of what they had accomplished. This facility, which had processed thousands of slaves over the years, would never hurt anyone again. The Korthak slave trade, which had seemed invincible just a year ago, was about to face the full weight of galactic justice. But perhaps most importantly, every freed slave in this facility now knew that resistance was possible, that freedom was worth fighting for, and that there were others in the galaxy who would risk everything to help them achieve it. As she prepared to leave the station that had once been her prison, Zara realized that the frightened girl who had been captured 3 years ago was truly gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned to turn pain into purpose and fear into determination. The galaxy was about to change in ways that the Korthak had never imagined. And it was going to change because a group of humans had refused to accept that suffering was inevitable, and a former slave had learned that even the most broken person could become a force for freedom. The real war for galactic liberation was just beginning. 2 years later, Zara stood before the Galactic Council, representing not just the human liberation fleet but also the newly formed coalition of free worlds. The Grand Chamber, with its soaring architecture and seats for representatives from hundreds of species, had once seemed like an impossible dream. Now it was the center of the most significant shift in galactic politics in over 1,000 years. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's advanced acoustic system. "The Korthak hegemony has operated systematic slavery operations across 47 star systems, involving the forced labor of over 12 million sentient beings." The massive holographic display behind her showed the data they had gathered from dozens of raids over the past 2 years. Financial records, shipping manifests, video evidence of abuse, and the testimonies of thousands of freed slaves painted a picture of cruelty and exploitation that shocked even the most jaded council members. In the Korthak delegation section, she could see familiar faces. Grex was there, no longer an overseer but a defendant in the largest war crimes trial in galactic history. His proud bearing had been replaced by the nervous posture of someone who knew their empire was crumbling around them. "The coalition moves that the Korthak hegemony be placed under immediate sanctions," Zara continued, "including a complete trade embargo, the seizure of all assets used in slave operations, and the establishment of liberation zones around all known slave facilities." The debate that followed lasted for days, but the outcome had been inevitable from the moment the evidence was presented. Species after species rose to condemn the Korthak practices, many admitting that they had turned a blind eye to atrocities they should have stopped years ago. The Arxian delegate, Councillor Tesh, delivered what many considered the most powerful speech of the proceedings. "We have all benefited from Korthak trade without asking where their cheap labor came from. We told ourselves it was not our concern, that we could not interfere with another species' internal affairs. But slavery is not an internal affair. It is a crime against all sentient life." When the final vote was tallied, the sanctions passed by an overwhelming margin. More importantly, the Council voted to establish the Galactic Liberation Authority, with humans as the primary enforcement arm and former slaves like Zara in key leadership positions. That evening, Zara found herself on the observation deck of the human embassy ship, looking out at the diverse fleet assembled around the Council station. Ships from dozens of species floated peacefully together, their crews working on joint operations that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Marcus joined her, as she had known he would. Their friendship had evolved over the years into something deeper, though neither of them had ever felt the need to define it precisely. They understood each other in a way that went beyond words. Hard to believe, isn't it? He said, settling beside her. 2 years ago, most of these species barely acknowledged that slavery existed. Now they're actively helping us shut it down. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore, Zara replied. But it was more than that. You showed them that change was possible, that someone was willing to act, not just talk. Marcus shook his head. We all showed them that. You, Vec, Corin, all the others who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they were. Humans just happened to have the ships and weapons when the movement needed them. Zara smiled at his characteristic humility. It was one of the things that had convinced her, early in her recovery, that humans truly were different from other species she had encountered. They seemed genuinely uncomfortable with taking credit for their achievements, always looking for ways to share recognition with others. What's next for you? Marcus asked. Now that the authority is established, you could go anywhere, do anything. You've more than earned the right to a peaceful life. Peace is nice, Zara said thoughtfully, but I think I'm more interested in making sure other people can have it too. There are still Korthak holdout systems, other species that practice slavery, pirates, and raiders who prey on the weak. The work isn't finished. It never will be completely, Marcus agreed. Evil doesn't just disappear because you pass a law against it. It has to be actively opposed, constantly. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars. Zara thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a terrified slave to a leader in the galactic fight for freedom. It hadn't been easy. There had been nightmares, setbacks, moments when the old fears had threatened to overwhelm her. But she had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite that fear. Zara, Marcus said quietly, I want you to know how proud I am of who you've become. When we first met, you were strong, but you didn't know it yet. Now you're helping others discover their own strength. You taught me that strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them, Zara replied. That's a lesson the whole galaxy is learning now. The next morning, Zara received her new assignment as Director of Liberation Operations for the Eastern Spiral Arm. It was a massive responsibility, coordinating rescue operations across dozens of star systems, managing refugee resettlement programs, and hunting down the remaining slave networks that had scattered when the Korthak Empire collapsed. But she wasn't facing it alone. The coalition now included over 200 species, with humans providing military support while others contributed their own unique skills and perspectives. Former slaves had become some of the most effective agents in the fight against their former oppressors, their understanding of victim psychology and criminal operations proving invaluable. As her ship prepared to depart for her new assignment, Zara took one last look at the council station. Just 5 years ago, she had been a broken slave with no hope for the future. Now she was heading out to ensure that millions of others would have the chance at freedom that humans had given her. The irony wasn't lost on her that the species the galaxy had, initially dismissed as young and naive, had become the moral leaders of galactic civilization. Humans had shown everyone that technology and military might meant nothing without the courage to stand up for what was right. But perhaps the greatest change wasn't in the laws or the institutions, it was in the way people thought about themselves and each other. The idea that suffering was inevitable, that the strong would always prey on the weak, had been replaced by something much more powerful, the belief that everyone deserved freedom, and that it was worth fighting for. As her ship entered hyperspace, carrying her toward new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference, Zara smiled. She had been saved by a human who believed that every life had value. Now it was her turn to pass that gift forward to others who needed it. The galaxy would never be perfect, but it was better than it had been. And tomorrow, with the continued efforts of all who believed in freedom, it would be better still. That was enough. That was everything,